Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, can China save Russia? After the fallout from Crimea, Western money's leaving Russia in spades. Who'll step in as the economy stumbles into recession? You can bet your last ruble that China will be there. And in this interconnected world of ours, what's the impact of Russia's sanctions on Eastern Europe and Central Asia? We speak to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development about that. Plus, protests, riots, even deaths in Vietnam. Has China overreached in the South China Sea dispute as a billion-dollar oil rig raises the stakes between the two nations? So it's all feeling a little bit Cold War-ish, isn't it? Russia's takeover of Crimea sparking Western nations to impose sanctions, Europe looking for alternative sources of energy to replace Russian gas. But from the West's perspective at least, it might just be working. At first the sanctions looked pretty tame, but they've ended up accelerating Russia towards recession and have got Moscow looking for new trade partners, or at least trying to re-strengthen existing ties. The thing is, the proof of the trouble is there for Moscow. $50 billion invested mostly in bonds and stocks has already left the country on account of the recent instability. And by the numbers, let's not forget Russia's actually in recession. The International Monetary Fund says that. Russia was widely expected to skirt with recession before the sanctions kicked in. But with the West putting up the shutters, Russia only needs to turn east for support, and that is exactly what it did. It did this, signing a $400 billion deal with China to supply 38 billion cubic meters of gas over 30 years. However, that is only $13 billion a year. If you convert it, it's only 2.2% of Russia's total exports, which are closer to $600 billion. And last year, we saw 200 billion cubic meters of gas exported, and most of that really went to Europe. So by all means, Russia can look east, but it can't turn its back on the West entirely. As for the China deal, well, Russia now needs to find $55 billion to even build the pipeline. And here's the thing. China isn't dependent on Russian gas. It can look to Turkmenistan, Myanmar, Australia and Qatar. Adrian Brown in Shanghai takes a look at this deal.
The Chinese and Russian presidents watched intently, and with good reason. This eagerly anticipated deal was the climax to 10 years of negotiation. China's agreed to pay around $400 billion for a 30-year supply of Russian gas. The haggling over price was still going on until just a few hours earlier. The deal provides an economic and political boost for President Vladimir Putin. European Union sanctions over Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea are beginning to hurt Russia's economy. President Xi Jinping also gets what he wants: more energy to fuel China's surging economy. The deal would pipe Siberian gas to China's northeast region. There are also plans for a second pipeline passing through the restive province of Xinjiang in northwest China. Russia and China have not always been so friendly. They almost went to war 50 years ago, and mutual suspicion may have been a reason why it took so long to sign a deal. A deal that is a further reminder that China is now the stronger economic partner.
I think strategically both sides need each other. I think in this sense, in this period, Russia needs more from China, I think.
Both leaders stress relations have never been stronger. Some ordinary Chinese seem to go along with that.
Japan is now very close to America, so China has to find a country to get closer to as well. That's why Russia and China are very friendly to each other now.
Although the two countries have had more cooperation in recent years, there are still many problems between China and Russia that need to be solved.
What may be the biggest energy deal in history was completed on the sidelines of an obscure security forum. Delegates included Iran's President Hassan Rouhani and leaders of the Central Asian republics. Many of them are also Russian gas customers. But for Russia and China, no gas deal has mattered more than this one.
So Vladimir Putin was in Shanghai to sign that deal. Along with him was our next guest, actually, Kirill Dmitriev, who is the CEO of the Russia Direct Investment Fund. Kirill's at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Tell us, Kirill, about this gas deal. How important was it for Russia, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's very critical. Obviously, negotiations were going for 10 years, and the fact that we reach conclusion is very important. It's not only important that it's a $400 billion deal for 30 years, but also lots of new projects will be developed because Russia will build massive gas transmission infrastructure. And for example, we are looking at the petrochemical terminals that will be created as a result of this. So very important win for Russia, very important good terms for China. So win-win for both and a very important deal.
Yes, but it must be more about strategic gains, because you mentioned that number, the $400 billion over 30 years, which, as we've already pointed out, isn't actually that much. $13 billion a year doesn't compare to the money which Russia makes with other gas deals, particularly the ones in Europe.
Well, but no, I think the price is very reasonable, and obviously, we wouldn't be, and Gazprom wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for, the right economic terms. And the sort of significance of this is having an opportunity to create lots of other sort of businesses that benefit from this transmission pipeline. So I believe it's a commercially very attractive term, but obviously, you can answer that Gazprom and, direct the question more to them.
All right, fair enough. Tell me about any other deals that you've done, because, one of the constant criticisms I hear of Russia is that it is just too reliant on its oil and gas money. So what else have you done on this trip to diversify, maybe?
Sure. Well, just when I was in Shanghai, we actually signed 3 deals, which I believe are representative of what Russian Direct Investment Fund is doing, and our companies that we created together with China Investment Corporation called Russia-China Fund. So first of all, we invested in the first bridge between Russia and China. It's very important because it basically streamlines the cargo transmit and makes it shorter by 700 kilometers. Secondly, we invested in tourism infrastructure between Russia and China, and that is growing quite significantly. And we also made an investment in the logistics business, and logistics sector is growing quite well. So basically, we believe that infrastructure, agriculture, logistics, healthcare are the sectors that are growing quite fast in Russia as Russia tries to diversify away from just the oil and gas sector.
Kirill, the thing which we really can't ignore at the moment is the fact that things are not good between Russia and the United States and Russia and Europe right now. That said, do you want to improve economic ties with those regions, or is it more at the moment a case of looking to other allies, particularly like China?
Well, I think it's definitely both. So I think we definitely want to have good relationships with Europe, with the US. I think they need to be pragmatic, long-term. And actually, we just had a panel where there were lots of investors from Europe, and we also have a number of US investors here. East is, and not just China, it's also Asia, it's Middle East, is growing in prominence because it's just growing. It's becoming more dominant in the world. China is either already #1 or will soon be #1 economy in the world. So I think for Russia, it's important to be having good relationship with the East, Middle East, Asia, and also with the West. And we believe that the pragmatic approach will persevere because many investors who are here from Europe are against sanctions, and they believe that actually them being here, sharing their voices, giving advice, is making Russia to be more liberal, more connected to the world, making Russia a better player in the world politics and economy.
Kirill Dmitriev from the Russia Direct Investment Fund joining us from St. Petersburg. Thank you for your time. So Russia obviously sees the China deal as a positive step, but all the other things going on, the recession, Ukraine's economy shrinking 7%, these are concerning factors. Now, the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, is watching it all closely. It's worried countries in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus and Central Asia, all which have ties with Russia, remember, could see their economy suffer as well. Well, Jonathan Charles joins us to talk about that now. He is a member of the executive board at the EBRD. He's with us from London this week. Jonathan, before we get into it, I wouldn't mind just quickly starting with what the EBRD actually does in Russia. Perhaps sort of set out your stall for us, if you would.
Well, the EBRD is the biggest investor on behalf of the international community in Russia, and it has been for more than 20 years. We invest, for example, about $2 billion a year over the past year or so. We have a total portfolio there of about 9 billion euros investment, and we invest primarily in the private sector. About 90% of what we do is investing in private sector companies, and that's primarily, and this is our mission in all of our countries of operations, our mission on behalf behalf of the international community is to help to develop the free market economy. The EBRD was set up after the fall of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, to help these countries move from communism towards capitalism, to develop free market economies, and that was seen as a way of bolstering wider change in countries, including political change.
So then what do you think when you see the state of Russia at the moment, an economy that is essentially in recession, that's got sanctions being piled up onto it as well, and that is really just being isolated more and more?
Well, the economy is clearly in some trouble, and it has been for a while. It was slowing down, of course. We've just released our latest economic forecast in the EBRD, and we can see and we predict that in Russia this year the economy will stagnate. There is a risk of recession, outright recession, and that was happening, of course, that slowdown, even before the current geopolitical tensions. We're seeing a slowdown anyway in consumer spending in Russia. We're seeing perhaps an economy that is too dependent on oil and gas and other natural resources, an economy that needs to diversify. So there are many reasons why the Russian economy is slowing down, and it's very clear that perhaps many years of not having enough reform doesn't make the economy flexible enough. It needs to do a lot to become more flexible. And at the moment, of course, on top we have these sanctions, which are not necessarily on their own having a massive impact on the economy, but people are predicting and are taking action believing that maybe further sanctions will come. So that's making people more wary about whether they want to invest there, and making citizens decide where they want to put their money. We've seen this massive capital outflow from Russia of more than 60 billion euros in the first few months of the year. Now that is more than during the first part of most of 2012, actually, and most of 2013.
Just go back to those sanctions for a moment for me, Jonathan. What effect are they having on the EBRD's work? You know, forget the wider economy for a moment. What is it affecting your work?
Well, certainly some of our shareholders, and you have to remember we're owned by many, many countries, including the big shareholders are the G7 countries. Some of them have expressed concern about what is happening in Russia, but they have not asked us at the moment to stop our activities there. We continue to process projects, and that's partially, I think, because our main commitment is to the private sector in Russia, and they understand that it's very important to keep encouraging reform in Russia. We keep having conversations with our shareholders saying that our work encourages reform and reformers, and not just economic reform. We're working primarily over the years to build up the middle class in Russia, those entrepreneurs. Now, the middle class are people who really want to see their country develop and to change, and it's probably important to keep doing that. We do a little bit of state sector work, but it is absolutely a minority. So for the moment, we carry on working in Russia, primarily concentrating, as I say, on developing the private sector.
What about regional effects here? I'm thinking primarily two things, remittances and exports. You know, you've got a ton of people from places like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Moldova, and they're all working in Russia. They're sending their money back. If Russia is suffering, then clearly they and their countries will suffer too. Not to mention exports, because most of these countries that I list, you know, Russia is their big trade partner as well. We've got to be talking some big effects here.
You can't see Russia in isolation from the whole region. When you look at Central Asia, for example, you have countries like Tajikistan, where about 60% of the economy is based on remittances. A lot of that comes from workers who are working in Russia. So if the Russian economy slows down, they can't send back as much money to Tajikistan. So the economy there has an impact. If you look at Moldova, it's a similar story. On the other side of Russia, far away from Central Asia, you've got a lot of Moldovans working inside Russia. Again, if they can't get work, then the economy of Moldova will slow down. And of course, you've got a lot of countries in the region which export to Russia. Now, if there isn't the demand for those products, or it is more difficult to export into Russia, then the economies will be hit. So we will see a regional impact. And we should mention Ukraine, of course, where the EBRD is very busy helping to bolster the economy there as part of the international community's response to what is going on. But you have to remember, a lot of Ukrainian exports go to Russia, and the situation with those geopolitical tensions is difficult. So you've got an economy there which is slowing down very fast. We're predicting in Ukraine a 7% contraction in the economy this year. Now that's partly, of course, because of the IMF program, which was really putting the squeeze on the economy. It's partly because of those higher gas prices which Ukraine is having to pay, which are very painful for the economy. But also, even if you can export into Russia and geopolitical tensions make that quite difficult, at the same time there may be less demand in Russia itself.
Jonathan Charles from the EBRD joining us from London. We thank you for your time this week. So Russia and China have sewn up that gas deal, even though there is a lot of work to do to make it happen. In the meantime, China's got other energy problems to worry about, namely the South China Sea and its oil and gas riches beneath. Have a look at it on the map. It's a bold move where China basically towed a billion-dollar oil rig into a position 220 kilometres off the coast of Vietnam, close to the Paracel Islands. And you shouldn't forget the Spratly Islands a bit further south as well. China claims those, as do many other nations in this whole region. Now, the confrontation got pretty ugly on the water, as you can see from these pictures, but there were unintended consequences in Vietnam as well. Days of violence in a third of the country's provinces. Mobs attacked Chinese-run factories, although many of them were in fact Taiwanese-owned. The fact that was clearly lost on those rioters. Now, even though you see dramatic things like that, it's important to remember this actually stems from the sea itself and what's at stake there. It's estimated the region has oil reserves of 28 billion barrels, but more importantly, gas reserves of 900 trillion cubic feet. Vietnam, for example, its oil reserves sit at around 4.4 billion barrels with proven gas reserves of 600 billion cubic feet. But they want to be careful about fighting over this, particularly Vietnam. Trade between it and China was worth over $50 billion last year. We're going to discuss this further now with Bill Emmett in London. He is the former editor of The Economist and author of a book called Rivals, which looks at the power struggle between China, India and Japan. Bill, historical claims or potential economic gains? Which one is it in this case, or is it, I dare say, a bit of both?
Well, I think that China's main motivation is actually strategic, which means that it's historic, because the history of the South China and East China Seas is that China controlled them for strategic reasons, in other words, for military protection and power projection. And I think that China wants to restore that and believes that that is the right way in which Asia should be conducted, and that American presence and obviously claims by Vietnam, by the Philippines, by Japan are illegitimate in its view, and for strategic reasons it wants to push back. There are resources, there are economic motivations, but I believe they are secondary.
Okay, what about Vietnam on the flip side of the coin? Do they have, support or sympathy given the size of might of what they're up against to China?
I think that Vietnam have a lot of sympathy from other Asian countries and from the United States. The trouble is that Vietnam doesn't really have close allies among those Asian countries, with the possible exception of Cambodia. And Cambodia has, unfortunately for Vietnam, a rather close relationship with China as well. So Vietnam has sympathy because Malaysia, the Philippines, Japan, obviously the United States in a different way, all feel there but for the grace of God go I. So we're in this together against a China which is pushing its territorial claims, its hegemony, its right to control this area. So Vietnam's got sympathy, but not a lot of people standing up next to it saying, we're with you.
Well, because a lot of those countries, and I include Vietnam with those, China is their main trading partner. And China has, we've already talked about the physical might and power and money, but it has strategic power over those smaller nations as well.
Well, you can't ignore China. China is the main trading partner. China provides a great flow of aid and investment as well. So, of course, no one wants really to confront China. No one wants really to alienate China. And yet, all of them feel increasingly oppressed by China. So they're looking for ways to push back. America is one of the ways. And getting America to declare that it stands by them, that their territorial claims have at least legitimacy, that these claims should be settled in an international court rather than simply by force or bullying. That's their main tactic. But the real question then is America really prepared to do what it takes to push China back? In other words, is America willing to be firm and aggressive to support them? And I think what China is doing bit by bit with this oil rig in Vietnam, with its pressure on the Philippines, with its air defense identification zone in the disputed islands with Japan, is constantly daring America to actually do something, and thereby exposing America's weakness, because America is willing to say a lot, but is it willing to do a lot? That's the question.
Well, to be fair, America did do something this past week, and yes, it may turn out to be more symbolic than anything else, but this was when it charged 5 Chinese officials with cybercrimes. Now, I know that is unrelated, but I guess the point that I'm making here is that China could be perceived as taking fire from all sides here. It's got the United States doing that, it's got Asian nations competing in the South China Sea. I wonder if there's a risk, and we're talking further down the track here, a risk of China getting painted into a corner, much the way Russia is these days.
Well, I think that there's some risk of that with this kind of cybercrime prosecution, particularly because, as with confrontations with Russia, there's always going to be potential for an accusation of double standards. We know from Edward Snowden and others that America spies on other people through cyberspace and all sorts of other methods. We know that this happens. So what really is the international sympathy going to be for a prosecution of China for doing what in the world's eyes seems to be exactly the same thing? America says, oh, no, this is for commercial reasons. They're stealing commercial secrets. That's different from us listening to Angela Merkel's telephone calls or bugging every email in the world, just in case you're a terrorist. But I think in the international court of public opinion, as it were, that's a pretty fine line. So I think that China has ability to push back, but also can play a bit the unfair victim in this kind of, as I say, game of propaganda.
Just as you mention commercial interests, Bill, and this is sort of to bring it back to our original topic, can there be a sort of commercial knock-on effect from what's going on in the South China Sea dispute? Again, the way that people were talking with that cybercrimes case about there possibly being negative knock-on effects for commerce and for business.
Well, I think that there can be, because I think the whole series of events in recent years, the cybercrime cases, a certain amount of technology theft or IP, intellectual property theft, the prosecution of Glaxo for bribery of drug purchasing officials in the Chinese health system. All of these might in many ways add up to, in the eyes of multinationals and international companies, to a sense that China is picking on them, and therefore China is an unsafe place to do business. You better protect your technology. You better be, you might not think of putting your factory there or your real operations there. You'd rather be somewhere else in Asia, and maybe you need extra protections against them. So there is some danger for China in this. Of course, China is not dependent any longer on multinationals or on foreign technology. It's got obviously great strength of its own, so it can withstand it, but there is some potential backlash. And I'd say there's a scenario, a hypothetical scenario in which the backlash could become quite serious. That scenario is if the Chinese economy itself, for its own domestic reasons, goes into a serious downturn. China looks a much less attractive place in which to be, because let's say there's a property crash and a real serious economic problem in China in the coming years. That then might be reinforced by multinationals saying, wait a minute, not only is this not the rosy, ever-growing economy we thought it was going to be, but also it's a dangerous place to be for cyber theft reasons. Let's stay out.
Bill Emmett, very interesting talking to you. Thank you for your time today. And that is our show for this week. More for you online, though, at aljazeera.com. If you just click through the programs link, from there you'll find the Counting the Cost page. It's got all our previous episodes to catch up on. You can also get in touch with the team. You can tweet either me, at Kamal AJE. There is our business editor, at Abid Oliver Ali. And don't forget to use the hashtag Counting the Cost as well. Or just drop us an old-fashioned email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.